In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at my new laptop docking station setup, which will include 10 Gigabit Ethernet, and how I've been able to build this setup for under £220. For many years now, I've been using this CalDigit TS3 Plus Thunderbolt 3 docking station, and it's worked absolutely brilliantly. I got this about 5 years ago, I want to say, and I made a video about it. I made a couple of videos, one reviewing it, one doing a teardown of it, and it's worked absolutely brilliantly. However, as we can see on the back, all we have is a Gigabit Ethernet port. And while that is absolutely fine, it's been brilliant for me for many years, and for most people it's absolutely fine, and to be honest, it's fine for me as well. I've upgraded the core of my network to 10 gig, so I've got 10 gig switching, 10 gig servers, and I want to be able to connect my laptop to those servers at higher speeds to allow me to transfer things like video files around. Because these video files I work with are absolutely huge, and being able to only being stuck transferring them at gigabit speeds is a little bit slow sometimes, so I kind of wanted to go beyond gigabit. But with this docking station, there isn't really any option to upgrade that. If we take a look at the ports on the back of the dock, we can see we only have 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, and one of those needs to connect off the computer, meaning there's only one free Thunderbolt port. But if we also look at this, you'll see that there's a display port and no other video outputs. So with this dock, to connect 2 monitors up, you need to use that second Thunderbolt pass-through port for the second monitor. So because I have 2 monitors, with this docking station, there's no way for me to connect an additional Thunderbolt NIC and have 2 monitors. So the only other option you'd have to upgrade this would be USB NICs. And realistically, for fast speeds, there's just not really any good options. As you can see here, we've got some 5 gigabit USB ports. These would be USB 3.2 Gen 1. And we've got 10 gigabit ports, that's USB 3.2 Gen 2. Hate that naming scheme, it's a complete mess. But yeah, so you've got some Gen 1 and Gen 2 USB ports. But when it comes to USB network cards, there aren't really any good options. There basically aren't any 10 gigabit USB network cards. They just don't exist. There are a bunch of 5 gigabit USB cards, so 5 gigabit Ethernet, and they're USB adapters, so those would work great. However, basically all the options I can find on the market only operate at USB 3.2 Gen 1 speeds. So your 5 gigabit network card would only connect to a 5 gigabit USB port. So in the face of it, that might seem fine. 5 gigabit Ethernet, 5 gigabit USB, what's the problem? Well, the problem with that is the overhead that USB adds. If you've got a 5 gigabit USB interface, once you add in all the USB overheads, those 5 gigabit USB NICs can only really get about 3.5 gig network traffic, which, I mean, it's fine, it's better than 2.5 gig, but it's nowhere close to 5 gig. So I didn't really want to do that. I mean, they're pretty expensive anyway, so spending all that money to get a 5 gigabit USB NIC that can only do 3.5 gig just didn't seem very sensible. So with this docking station, there really isn't an upgrade path. I can't use Thunderbolt because that's used for my second monitor. There aren't any 10 gigabit USB NICs, and the only USB NICs I can really get would max out at 3.5 gigs, so yeah, it just really wasn't going to work with this docking station. But I found a solution. This is a Dell WD22TB4 Thunderbolt 4 docking station. And this is an absolutely perfect option for this, because if we look around the back, we've got a Thunderbolt connection that will go off the laptop, and then 2 Thunderbolt pass-through ports. So I can connect one monitor to this, and still have a free Thunderbolt port to connect a 10 gigabit Ethernet card. And this seems to be a thing that's more common with Thunderbolt 4 docks. When it comes to Thunderbolt 3 docks, almost all of them, in fact I'm pretty sure all of them, just have a single Thunderbolt pass-through port. But with Thunderbolt 4 docks, a lot more of them have additional Thunderbolt ports. Some have even more than this. This has 3 if you include the uplink one, but I've seen ones with even more than that. So with Thunderbolt 4 NICs, you get a lot of additional Thunderbolt pass-through ports, which is ideal for what I'm doing here. But why did I go for this one in particular? It's a bit of a weird option going for a Dell docking station when I'm using a MacBook. Well, these docks actually can be very good value. Sure, when they're new, they're still good £250 or so, and there's a lot of other Thunderbolt 4 docks around that price. But what's good with these ones is, unlike all the other docks from the likes of OWC, Razer, CalDigit, all those other kinds of brands, these Dell docks are sold to big companies and big enterprise IT contracts. So when those companies are finished with them, unlike an average consumer with their OWC or CalDigit dock that'll want to sell it for the best possible price, these docks are just disposed of by big companies en masse and turn up on eBay very cheaply. I picked this up for £79. So yes, it's second hand, but other than a couple of minor surface scratches, it's really good condition. So I paid £79 for this docking station, where something new would be, a good couple £100. So with these docks, the Dell ones, and I think some of the HP ones as well, basically the ones targeted at big enterprise IT companies, are very cheap to pick up second-hand, despite having all the ports we would need for this setup. Now, of course, the other option here would be why am I not buying just a Thunderbolt dock with built-in 10 gig Ethernet? Simply, there aren't really many options. There's only one that I found, and it comes from OWC. It's a Thunderbolt 3 dock, but it does have 10 gigabit Ethernet built in. But it costs about £350, so it's a lot more expensive than this setup I've done here. And what that would then mean is the 10 gigabit Ethernet interface would be built into the docking station. So I'm kind of tied in, I've got almost less of an upgrade path. Whereas going for this setup here with a Thunderbolt dock and a separate 10 gig Thunderbolt NIC means that not only is it cheaper, but in the future I can upgrade the NIC or upgrade the docking station independently of one another. You know, if I got a new docking station in the future, say with Thunderbolt 5 when that comes out, I could continue to use the existing network adapter. Or if I decide to, I get a new docking station in the future that has 10 gig Ethernet built in, and I no longer need that 10 gig NIC, well, I've now got a separate portable 10 gig NIC I could reuse elsewhere. So it just seems like a much more upgradable solution than paying more money for a dock with the network interface built in, which realistically, as far as I'm aware, I think they're the same network interface anyway, so it wouldn't really be a big benefit doing that. So I decided to go for this. And then the other thing you might be asking is, obviously I point out this dock here only has a single Thunderbolt pass-through port that I need to use for a second display because I've got DisplayPort and Thunderbolt pass-through. But you may be looking at a dock like this that has an absolute ton of display outputs and thinking, well sure, I went and bought this one that's got the Thunderbolt pass-through port, but say the older generation of this, the Dell WD22TB4, that one's got a bunch of display outputs, and even though it's only got one Thunderbolt pass-through port, why can't I connect all my monitors to the display ports and connect my network to the one Thunderbolt pass-through port? Why do I have to get this particular Thunderbolt 4 dock rather than all the other Thunderbolt 3 docks that, unlike my CalDigit, actually have a bunch of display outputs? Well, this is due to the sort of compatibility between Macs versus PCs when it comes to displays over Thunderbolt docks. If you look at Thunderbolt docks, you'll kind of see two different categories. You'll see the ones that are targeted towards PCs and ones that are targeted towards Macs. And that's kind of what we've got here. The Dell one is obviously very targeted towards PCs, and this CalDigit in its space grey colour is very much targeted towards Macs. And if you look at those, you'll see this sort of behaviour with display outputs. The PC ones tend to have a lot of different display outputs and support a lot of monitors on paper, whereas the Mac ones will generally only have one display output and one Thunderbolt pass-through port, or maybe multiple pass-through ports on a more modern dock, but they'll only have one dedicated display output. And this is because Macs do not support DisplayPort MST, whereas PCs do. So these docks that are designed for PCs are using DisplayPort MST and an MST hub to handle all these additional display outputs. Whereas on a Mac, they don't support that. So the docks targeted to Macs don't include an MST hub and therefore only have one display output. So with a dock like this that's designed for PCs, if you plugged a PC into this, sure, you could use all these additional display outputs and you'd have two Thunderbolt pass-through ports for loads of additional devices. But if you plug a Mac into a dock like this, while these display outputs will work, they'll all mirror one another. You won't be able to connect multiple displays to these and extend your desktop. You'll just get a mirrored output on each of these display outputs. So to connect a Mac to a Thunderbolt dock, you can connect one display to the internal display ports, be it just one of them or one of these ones, but the secondary display has to be connected to a Thunderbolt pass-through port. So that's just something really important to bear in mind. It gets particularly tricky if you're in, say, an office environment where you've got a bunch of desks that are potentially used by either PCs or Macs. With that, the only real option I found that works is to use Thunderbolt docks, not docks that use DisplayPort over USB. They have to be Thunderbolt docks. You need PCs and Macs that both support Thunderbolt. Of course, all the Macs do, but your PCs need to also support Thunderbolt. And then when you're connecting them up, you need to connect one monitor to the onboard display ports, the other monitor to a Thunderbolt pass-through port, and with that, you'll have a solution that will work for both Macs and PCs in a kind of hot desking environment. Don't know I'm giving that detail in this video, but there's not much information online about how to make that work, but that's kind of what you need to do. But yeah, put simply, with a Mac on a Thunderbolt dock, you can't use the multiple display outputs. You need to use one of the Thunderbolt pass-through ports for your second display. So if you want a Thunderbolt pass-through device additional to a second display, you need to have a Thunderbolt dock that has two Thunderbolt pass-through ports. So that's why we have that there. But yeah, let's get this CalDigit dock out of the way and take a look at this Dell dock, because it's actually quite a nice option. So here we have the dock here. Dell are quite interesting with their docks. We'll take this apart later. But if you look at this, it looks very similar to the older Dell docks. And that's because with Dell's docking stations, what they have is it's actually a two-part unit. You have this piece on the end here that is removable. You unscrew it, we'll take it out later. And this handles the communication with the computer. And then you have this part here that's the docking station. And they sell various different versions of it where this part is the same, but this part is different. So this is the WD22TB4, which is the Thunderbolt 4 dock with 2 Thunderbolt pass-through ports. They also have the older WD19TB2, I think it's a TB2, the older WD19 model with Thunderbolt pass-through. So it has a Thunderbolt connection, you have a Thunderbolt pass-through port here, and then this part's the same. That also works for Macs and PCs, but you've only got one Thunderbolt port for your second display. And then they also do another model that I can't remember the model number of, but it's a WD19 and it doesn't have Thunderbolt. Instead, it's a USB dock that uses DisplayPort to get the video to the dock. It looks again very similar to this, but it doesn't have any Thunderbolt pass-through ports, and instead you only have the display ports on the docking station itself. So if you wanted to use that with a Mac, you'd only get a single monitor, but if you've got a PC that supports MST, you'd be able to use multiple monitor outputs. So with these docks, the only real difference between the various models is just this additional module on the end. Then you've got this part here that essentially is basically just USB based and then DisplayPort. So this part here doesn't have any Thunderbolt logic in it. This part here takes that Thunderbolt connection, handles it, does the pass-through ports, and then just gives this section USB and DisplayPort. So everything else on here hangs off of USB. We'll do a teardown later and talk about that. But you've got essentially a NIC, a couple of USB 3 ports, DisplayPort, USB pass-through. I think that can also do USB as well, but it's a DisplayPort and USB 3 kind of combo port. HDMI, 2 display ports. It is HDMI 2.0 as well, which is good. Gigabit Ethernet, which I think again does run off of USB, but it is a Gigabit Ethernet port. Power supply connection. This is uses a 180 watt charger. I think it can provide, 180 watts or 120 watts, a very high power to Dell laptops. And then it does 90 watts for other laptops. So 90 watts for my Mac is absolutely fine. Then on the front, you get a 10 gigabit USB Type-C port and a USB-A port. So that's pretty decent I/O. There's also older models that have an audio jack as well. They seem to remove that after a few generations. I suspect either just cost cutting or no one used it. But yeah, that's what you've got there. Finally on the top, you've got a power button. This is only going to work with Dell laptops. It'll work as a docking station for any other laptop, but just generally docks that have a power button on them only work with that. The power button will only work on that particular brand of laptop. The only other thing you might notice with this dock that's a bit different to others is that the Thunderbolt cable is permanently attached. And that is a bit of a disadvantage in the sense if this ever gets damaged, you're not going to be able to replace that. And of course, you can't really change where it comes out the back of the unit, it comes out the side, and you can't really get different lengths. But I can see why they've done it. Whereas a ColourDigit dock like this that does have a detachable Thunderbolt cable, that's absolutely great, and it's absolutely brilliant for, say, home users or environments where it's maybe in someone's private office. These Dell docks are designed for big corporate IT deployments, where you're going to kit out an entire office with these. And I can almost guarantee that if you kitted out an office with docks like this, with detachable Thunderbolt cables, you would constantly be fighting these cables going missing. And I'm not meaning it in the sense of people, stealing company property and sneaking it away and selling it on or whatever. What I'm meaning is that if you put an office with a bunch of these docks like that, what's going to happen is you're going to have all these docks, people are going to be in the office, someone's phone's going to run out of charge, they'll need a USB-C cable, they'll go, oh, where's a USB-C cable? Oh, there's one on a spare desk. They'll take the cable out, they'll charge their phone with it, and then this cable will just end up falling into someone's bag, into a desk drawer, and just disappearing. And the problem is Thunderbolt cables are not just USB-C cables. They work as those, but they're generally quite expensive, quite hard to get. Well, not hard to get, but they're not just commodity cheap cables. They're relatively expensive cables. So in an office environment, I can almost guarantee you just end up with these cables wandering off constantly. So I can definitely see why they've attached the cable, because with this, your cable's not going to walk away. And you see the exact same thing on other docks like this. HP's ones, for example, also have permanently attached cables. Lenovo's, I think, do have detachable cables, but there's some weird extra bulky connector that plugs into the back of the dock on some of those. But yeah, it is a permanently attached cable, but I can see why they've done it, given the use case for this dock. So that's a lot of rambling about the docking station, but part of the main point of this project is to get 10 gigabit Ethernet. So how are we doing that? Well, I'm going to be using this, which is a Sabrent TH-S3EA Thunderbolt 3 10 gigabit NIC. There's a bunch of different options like this on the market. There's a bunch of different 10 gigabit NICs. It's a bit dusty. There's a bunch of different 10 gigabit Thunderbolt NICs, but they're all basically the same. There isn't currently a Thunderbolt 3 10 gigabit network chip. There's not a dedicated chip that does that. So all of these devices have a Thunderbolt 3 controller and have a separate PCI Express based network card. And as far as I can tell, almost all the options on the market that I could find using a Quantia AQC107S. So even though this one's from Sabrent, there's other ones from Sonnet, another one from QNAP. They're all basically the same as far as I can tell underneath. And this Sabrent is a very good value option. I think I paid about £140 for this. It's a fair bit cheaper than some of the other options. Before I picked this up, I picked up a QNAP model, and it also looked pretty good, and it was, again, a Quantia NIC, and I got that even cheaper because I got it in some sort of Amazon warehouse deal, but it had an active cooling fan. It was a fair bit smaller than this, which is probably why it needed the cooling fan, but the fan was so annoyingly loud, I couldn't use it. It was that kind of high-pitched whine that while it was technically temperature controlled, as soon as you did anything slightly network intensive, the fan would ramp up and then run continuously basically until you restarted it. So that just wasn't going to be an option. I even tried hiding it under my desk, still could hear it, I had to get rid of it and return it. Whereas this one is fully passively cooled. It comes in this kind of silicone jacket, which I presume to stop it scratching, but you could take that off, and if you take it off, you can see it's got these heatsink fins around the side. Given I'm not traveling with mine, what I might do just to improve the cooling is take this jacket off, and I'll just stick some like rubber feet on the bottom just so it doesn't slide around. But yeah, that's it there. You've got a 10 gig network interface on that, although it does operate at multi-gig speed, so it'll do 10 gig, 5 gig, 2.5 gig, 1 gig, and I think even 100 meg. So yeah, it's multi-gig essentially, but it will go up to 10 gig. And if you look around the back, you can see we have a Thunderbolt pass-through port, or a Thunderbolt connection there. This is just Thunderbolt 3, but it's all backwards compatible, so that's completely fine. So yeah, this should work pretty well. And that's something else I heard, is that when it comes to network interface on macOS, it generally is better to use a Thunderbolt or a PCI Express based network interface like this, rather than a USB one. I think macOS prefers that, so yeah, this should be a pretty good option. And given I paid about £140 for this, and I paid about £80 for this dock, I paid about £220 for this entire setup, which compared to that £350 dock from OWC is pretty good value. So yeah, really excited to try this out and see how well it works. So yep, that's the dock we're talking. That's the network controller there. So we have the 10 gigabit network controller and the Dell docking station we'll be using. Okay, so very quickly before we actually set this up and actually take a look at it working, let's pop this open and see what's inside, because docking stations are always quite interesting because essentially they've all just got dedicated chips for the various functions and they're all connected together over some sort of central protocol. So either, in this case, it's mostly going to be USB, whereas, oh no. So as I was saying before, throwing my drink absolutely everywhere, in these docks, you've essentially got a bunch of different chips, all connected over a common protocol. So in the case of this dock here, it's all connected over USB. And in the case of this dock here, the CAL digit, it's mostly PCI Express. So you've got a PCI Express NIC, and then all the USB ports are handled by PCI Express USB controllers. So they kind of work a bit differently. But yep, let's pop this open. So I've already taken out most of the screws because the screws on this are a bit of a pain. The two here to remove this Thunderbolt I/O modules are very easy to get to, but the others are kind of under this rubber pad. So you can see there's like one in the corner there, one there. You can kind of feel it by pressing down. So you need to then like peel this pad up and get under to get those screws out. So I've already taken those out. So you just need to get these two on the end out. So that should be a lot easier. So get that out there. Take that one out there. Like that. And then if we flip it over, this module unplugs. So pull that out there. And then that there should just come off. And this is something Dell market is kind of being apparently upgradable. So what they're saying is you can buy these docking stations and you can buy these modules separately and swap out the I/O. Now, I don't know if anyone would ever actually do that in practice, but it does mean that say you had the older or the more basic USB version of this that doesn't have Thunderbolt, and then you needed to upgrade to Thunderbolt model, say for example you're in a hybrid environment with Macs and PCs and you wanted dual monitor, or maybe you're currently a PC-only environment and you're introducing Macs, so therefore you need to move to Thunderbolt versions of this dock, you could potentially buy these modules and swap them onto your existing docks, although I don't know if anyone actually would. But what they essentially do is this piece here handles the I/O, so in this case it's going to handle Thunderbolt. You might get one that's just USB instead. And then over this card connector here, all it passes is USB and DisplayPort. So then all the USB and DisplayPort is handled by this. Now, I'm not going to take this board apart any further, just because there's this sort of can over the main Thunderbolt IC, and it's attached onto this here, which holds in the connector to this cable, which is going to be a very fragile connector with a ton of pins. And I really don't want to break this because I do need to use it. But under here, all you're going to have is an Intel Thunderbolt controller. And based on the list of all the Thunderbolt 4 controllers on the market, there's only 3. This will almost certainly be an Intel JHL 8440, because it's the only Thunderbolt 4 controller that has multiple Thunderbolt ports. So given you've got a Thunderbolt port into it and then multiple Thunderbolt ports out, it'll have to be that model. The other ones don't really have that because they're designed for other devices such as this, where all you'd have is a single Thunderbolt port, and then the other devices are going to be PCI Express or similar. So yeah, it'll almost certainly be an Intel JHL 8440. So with this part out of the way, now let's take a look at the docking station itself. So now I've removed all the screws, the top just lifts off like that. Now you can see the inside. And interestingly, this dock does have an active cooling fan. It probably doesn't really need it. Like, the fan does run off or maybe very, very low most of the time. But equally, this CalDigit dock does get kind of warm, so I can see why they've done it. Especially for something like this going into corporate environments, a little bit of fan noise isn't an issue, or is much less of an issue than overall reliability would be. But I've used this a little bit before I made this video, I've tested it out, and I've used these Dell docks extensively and the older WD19 models. And yeah, the fan is basically inaudible. I've maybe had a couple of occasions on not this dock, but on other docks like this I've used, where for some reason the fans decided to get stuck on full speed, but generally just unplugging and plugging the dock in resolves that, and it's generally like, a once a year kind of occurrence, so it's not really an issue. So we'll take the fan out there, it's just a little sort of blower fan like that. There's a model on the back if you really care about it, but that's the fan there. And under here we can see all the different chips that make up this docking station. So what I'll do now is I'll go away, get some part numbers off these, and just briefly point out what they do. We might be able to work out a bit of the architecture of this, kind of how things link together, but I won't go and spend too much time researching that because I really just don't have the time right now. But I'll go in, I'll get what some of these parts are, and we'll talk about them. Okay, so I've now gone away and I've taken a look at this and I've worked out what some of these chips are, and we can maybe start to roughly see how this is kind of laid out. I've not gone into a huge amount of detail and figured out everything, but we can get the right idea from this. So we'll just go through each of these chips one by one and talk about them. So first of all, we have these two big chips in the middle. And these are Realtek chips. The one on the left is an RTS 5487, and the one on the right is an RTS 54130. And I can't find too much information on these other than like the various part lists to kind of buy them, which is a bit weird, there's no proper data sheets. But I did find another teardown of this dock that goes into a bit more detail, and it kind of clarifies my suspicion of these, and these are USB hubs. And if you look in software and try and work out what sort of the USB architecture of this is, one of these is going to be a USB 10 gigabit hub, and the other one's going to be a 5 gigabit hub. And what you have is we have the Thunderbolt controller over here. That produces a USB 10 gigabit signal. That 10 gigabit USB port on the Thunderbolt controller connects the 10 gigabit hub here, and then the 5 gigabit hub hangs off of the 10 gig hub. Then we have this chip here, which is the Ethernet controller. This is a Realtek RTL8153BND, and that's a Gigabit Ethernet controller, and that hangs off the 10 gigabit USB hub. So you have the 10 gig comes in, the Ethernet hangs off the 10 gig hub. The 10 gig hub also is going to handle the USB-C ports. You've got the 10 gig USB-C port here, and this dual mode port on the back that's DisplayPort and 10 gig USB-C. So those both hang off of that, so that gives you 10 gig USB. And then all the 5 gig USB ports hang off this 5 gig USB controller. I suspect on some of the other models that have the audio interface, those would also hang off the USB, presumably off the 5 gig USB controller, but this doesn't have the audio interface. Although you can see there is actually space here for an audio jack, and I suspect this area here would have possibly had the old audio chip. Sort of space there for an audio IC there, but yeah, this doesn't have any kind of audio on it. Couple more chips of note. So we've got this chip here, which is a PS8469, and this is a dual mode DisplayPort retimer, they call it. So it seems to take in DisplayPort and to kind of handle the signal, retime it, and also seems to allow outputting both DisplayPort and HDMI. So that's probably how the HDMI is being handled here, is this chip will be converting sort of from DisplayPort to HDMI to give this HDMI port. Next up we've got this chip here, which is a TPS65988, and this is a USB-C port controller that also handles power delivery. Because with USB-C ports, you need a dedicated controller that handles things like the reversing of the ports, so it's reversible, and things like power delivery negotiation. And that's what that chip handles there. And I suspect that'll handle both this port and this port. I suspect it'll handle both of those because I can't see another one of those on this board, unless it's on the underside. I've not taken this out. The only other fundamental chip here is this one here, and it's a Synaptics VMM5331BJG, and it's an MST hub. So this handles the MST functionality to allow all these display ports to work on a PC. And this is what I was saying earlier, where this won't work on a Mac for multiple displays out of these ports because they don't support MST. A Mac will happily display through this chip and it'll allow you to get a single display out of these, but if you have a compatible PC that supports multi-stream transport, then this will allow you to have multiple displays hanging off of that one display port that comes from the Thunderbolt controller. That's really all that's of note here. There's a little PIC32 microcontroller here. This will probably handle some various things on the board, such as the fan control, stuff like that. It'll probably also handle this power button here. Looking under the sort of USB device tree on Windows, you can see that there's a weird Dell human interface device showing up that I suspect is probably that button, things like that. But I'm not going to go into too much detail digging this apart. That blog post I found is much better, and if I remember, I'll link it in the description, but I'll probably forget, but I'll try and remember to do that. So yeah, that's what you have inside the dock there. And it's kind of interesting seeing a dock like this, where this board is clearly designed to be more universal between Thunderbolt and USB docks, versus a dedicated Thunderbolt dock like this. Because with this dock here, everything on this board is DisplayPort and USB. There's no Thunderbolt or PCI Express stuff on this board. So that means that with this docking station here, if it's got a Thunderbolt module in the end like mine has, this will work with Thunderbolt, and then the Thunderbolt pass-through is handled on here. But if the DisplayPort over USB modules put on here instead, it can be plugged into a computer that supports DisplayPort over USB. All these devices will still work, the DisplayPorts will still work, because this is purely USB based. Whereas a dedicated Thunderbolt 3 dock like this CalDigit is Thunderbolt on the back, and it's only ever going to be Thunderbolt on the back, and that means that all the devices in this hang off of PCI Express, so it's a PCI Express based NIC, and all the USB ports are using PCI Express USB controllers. So it's just a different way of doing it, but it does make sense. But yeah, that was a bit interesting to see inside. What we'll now do is get this put back together, get it set up on my desk, get the 10 gig NIC installed, and we'll try it out and see how well it works. Okay, so here we have my desk set up, and I've got the docking station now installed, and it works. So we'll quickly talk through what we have here. So we have a pair of 4K monitors. These are 4K 60. We have my keyboard and mouse, basic stuff you'd expect. And then for audio, we have my 2 Adam audio speakers, which are connected to this audio interface. This is a Mackie Big Knob Studio, and yes, they did call it a Big Knob Studio. Great naming. Maybe it's only funny to people in the UK, but yep, that's what it's called. So that's my audio interface, and that connects over USB into the docking station. Likewise, the keyboard connects over USB into the docking station. And then for the network interface, I could have put it on the desk, but instead of putting it on the desk and cluttering it up, under this desk I've got a big cable basket, so I've put the network adapter under that. It's plugged into the network there, so the cable goes off and into a network switch that's in this cabinet, into a 10 gig switch, and then that plugs into this dock over Thunderbolt, so that just keeps things a bit neater. For connecting everything up to the dock, what we have is one of the monitors is connected over DisplayPort on the right hand side. 2 USB ports are connected to the various USB devices here. Then power, and then what we have is the second monitor is connected over a DisplayPort to USB-C cable, plugged into one of the Thunderbolt pass-through ports, and then the second Thunderbolt pass-through port goes under the desk and is plugged into that network adapter. So that's how we've got that all set up. So now if I plug the laptop in, everything should work. So if we wake the laptop up and we plug in the Thunderbolt cable, it's not ideal as it comes out the opposite side of the dock from what I would really want here, but I've got it routed around neatly enough. It works absolutely fine. So that plugged in there. We give it a few seconds for everything to start up and connect. There we go. And there we go. Both my dock monitors are now connected. So now we have both monitors and the laptop screen. So we've got 3 monitors and the network. Everything else is all going to be connected up. So that's working. Okay, so that was a look at all the basic functionality, and it all works fine. So really nothing to write home about. It does exactly what it's meant to do. But now let's talk about the network speed, because that was the main goal of this project, to get multi-gig network speeds. But also, things get a little bit interesting here. So let's take a look at it. So here we have open speed test. This is a speed test that's running on my server. So my server's running this speed test server. So I'm testing directly to my own server, which is over the 10 gig network. Of course, I could use something like iPerf here. This is just much easier and nicer to demonstrate on camera. So we run a speed test here. We'll see what we get. So that's running. It takes a little second to ramp up to full speed, but after a few seconds, we hit a full 10 gig download speed. Of course, this is testing HTTP throughput, so there's overheads there. So this is a full 10 gigabit download. So that's working absolutely perfectly. But now let's see what happens to the upload, because this is where things get a little bit interesting. Starts off a bit low and starts ramping up again. But as we can see, we're hitting maybe about 7 gig, 7.5 gig. We're not hitting a full 10 gig upload. So why is that? Now, this is actually something that's not surprising to me. I actually was interested to see how this would pan out. And it's actually working better than I probably expected it to. But this is because what we're actually hitting here as a bottleneck is nothing to do with a new network interface or anything like that. We're hitting the Thunderbolt 40 gigabit network transfer limit. Because as you probably know, a Thunderbolt connection, Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4 are limited to 40 gigabit. Now that sounds huge. So, 10 gig Ethernet, why is that limited by 40 gig? Well, the reason's right in front of you. These 2 monitors. Because these are a pair of 4K 60 monitors. And you work at the data rate required for a 4K 60 monitor, you're looking at about 15, 16 gigabit a second per monitor. So as soon as you're trying to send both of those over a 40 gigabit Thunderbolt connection, you're not leaving that much headroom for anything else. And the way Thunderbolt works is the Thunderbolt controller interleaves all the packets from all the different interfaces connected to it, so the USB, the Thunderbolt devices, the displays, it interleaves all of those onto that single 40 gigabit connection. And it has some sort of concept of quality of service. So things like monitors and video get the highest priority because a monitor doesn't have any kind of buffer. It can't just slow down or drop data. It would break. So the monitors have to get their full throughput. So it'll prioritize video throughput. And then after the video throughput, in that remaining bandwidth, it'll fit in other data such as USB and Thunderbolt traffic. So what you're seeing here is the monitors are getting that priority, and the Thunderbolt networking data is being fed in on the excess bandwidth that we have on this 40 gig link. And as you can see, it's also working bidirectionally. So we're getting a full 10 gig download because there's nothing really coming into the computer. We're not really transferring any data in the dock to computer direction apart from the network traffic that we're downloading. But with the monitors, they are essentially sharing with the upload because the video is coming from the computer to the monitor, so it's going in the same direction as that network upload traffic, which is why it's the upload that's constrained and not the download. And we can see this is definitely the case. So if I unplug one of these monitors, so I'm going to unplug the left-hand monitor, which is the Thunderbolt pass-through monitor. So as you can see, that monitor's disconnected and gone off, so we'll bring the speed test back over onto the screen. The resolution's gone a bit funny on the screen because it's got a new monitor, but now if we restart this and start to test again and see what happens. So once again, download starts off a bit slow, takes a few seconds to ramp up, but we're getting a full 10 gig download. And now, once it starts the upload, we should see that we should actually get a full 10 gigabit upload. And that's because going from the computer to the monitor now is only about a 15 gig stream for the single monitor. So there's plenty of excess capacity on that Thunderbolt link to get us a full 10 gig upload speed. Now, it's not quite as high, it's hitting about 9 gigabit. But again, there's overheads here. I don't know how fast it is for the computer generating the packets for the speed test. But as you can see, we're getting a much higher upload speed. So that definitely demonstrates that we're actually being constrained by having those two monitors on the docking station. And then as a final test, because that still didn't get the full 10 gig upload, I'm going to try with both monitors disconnected. So I'm still connected to the docking station, but both monitors are now unplugged. So let's run a test purely on the laptop. There's now nothing from the laptop going to that docking station in terms of like video traffic. So again, we get the full 10 gig download. And it'll be interesting to see what the upload is here. Do I actually get the full 10 gig upload now there's no monitors at all? Yeah, we're getting a little bit higher here. We're getting about 9.1 gig. We're getting close to basically maxing out the upload. I do wonder that even if we're not completely maxing out the Thunderbolt connection with only having a single monitor, if there's potentially still some level of bottlenecking just by the traffic having to be interleaved by the Thunderbolt controller, I suspect that will slightly impact the bandwidth. But yeah, that kind of shows how the sort of Thunderbolt connection works and how you can actually hit the bandwidth limit of that 40 gig Thunderbolt connection relatively easily if you've got high resolution monitors. But ultimately for my use case, this is absolutely fine. 10 gig download and 7.5 gig upload is more than enough. It basically allows me to max out the speed of my server for uploading that. So yes, my upload speed is slightly constrained. 7.5 gig is more than enough. So that's absolutely fine. But it is important to bear in mind that if you're setting up Thunderbolt docking stations, you do need to bear in mind that link there. You can't just do something crazy like have two 4K monitors, a 25 gig network interface, and some sort of PCI Express enclosure connected to it. It would work, but you're not going to get 25 gig. So something important to bear in mind there. You are going to potentially be constrained by that link, especially if you're dealing with high resolution monitors. So there you go. That's a look at my new Thunderbolt docking station setup, and it works absolutely brilliantly. I'm really glad I went for the setup rather than just buying that single OWC dock that has 10 gig Ethernet, because this was a lot cheaper, about £130 cheaper, and it's a bit more flexible because I can upgrade the network adapter separately, I can upgrade the dock separately, I can use the network adapter standalone away from this setup. It's just a bit more flexible, and I'm really happy with how well it works. I get full 10 gig download speeds, and sure, my upload speeds are limited to 7.5 gigabit, but I think I'll survive. And it's really interesting seeing how Thunderbolt manages bandwidth and has that sort of quality of service behavior, where it's clearly prioritizing the video traffic going into the displays and then fitting in the upload network traffic in between. In this setup here, it's absolutely fine. 7.5 gig upload is huge, really not a problem at all. But it is something interesting to bear in mind, an important consideration. Because not only could you have a 10 gig Ethernet controller on this, you could also potentially have some sort of Thunderbolt storage array, external SSDs, various things like that. And you could potentially hit that limit in a much more significant way. Say you had an external SSD array and then you've also got a 10 gig Thunderbolt NIC and two 4K displays, and you're trying to transfer data across the network through that network card to your external storage, you could potentially start to hit more of a limit there. And it's also worth bearing in mind from the bandwidth sharing perspective is that will also impact things like the USB ports. So if you say had a 10 gig USB, say a USB SSD plugged into the dock, and then we're trying to transfer it over the network interface over Thunderbolt, you could actually potentially hit that bandwidth as well between your USB device and your network adapter. Not really an issue for me. I do actually record a USB SSD, but that then gets plugged into the laptop's USB ports, not into the docking station, so that's fine, but it is just important to bear that in mind. But yeah, the setup works really well, really happy with it, and hopefully it serves me well for years to come. But all that's left to say now is thank you very much for watching.